and obviously to be recorded as well for posterity. And I should also mention welcome to some of my fellow club members, stragglers, who've joined this afternoon. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is basically go through some of the aspects of my book, which will be published on the 26th of April formally, but I've already sent out a few copies to interested people. And it's the history of the club, which in 1925 was founded, so it's 100 years now. And it's a club which I joined actually almost 50 years ago in 1976 in Germany when I was a young army officer. And over the past few years, I've been sort of gearing up to write this history because I thought it would be nice to have a sort of pamphlet describing the club's history. But the more I delved into it, the more I realized that the Stragglers has an absolutely fascinating history, and one which is, I think, becoming from an academic point of view, very relevant to today's times, where you have a lot of discussion of the end of empire, of post-colonialism, of the role of race in modern society. And the Stragglers, as I say, approaching this from the academic view, I think is a fantastic example in a microcosm of many of the social changes that we've seen over the last 100 years. But with that background, let me go into the history of the club, and I will concentrate on the first 50 years, which is to apologize to my fellow stragglers. I'm not going to mention any of you at this stage. So as I mentioned, the club was founded in 1925, and it's quite an interesting time in India because obviously at that time there had been a lot of unrest already and a lot of agitation towards Indian independence. Gandhi had come back to India from South Africa in 1915. There'd been the terrible event, the Amritsar massacre, where a British officer had ordered his troops to fire on unarmed civilians and killed over 300. It was an environment where E.M. Forster had just published in 1924 a passage to India, which was rather different, to a different view of empire, if you like, than the sort of Rudyard Kipling, which most people at the time had grown up with. So the club was born into this slightly febrile atmosphere. And the circumstances of its founding are rather romantic and quite interesting. And we know about them from a letter that one of the founder members wrote actually in 1956. His name was P.B. Sanger, Tony Sanger. And he described the foundation of the club in these terms. And I'll just quote from that letter. In the early 1920s, when stationed in Ambala in the Gunners, i.e. the Royal Artillery, I was invited by the late Maharaja of Patiala to take a cricket team to Chail every summer. Chail was in the Shimla Hills, 7,000 feet up. The Maharaja had cut off the top of one of the peaks and made a cricket ground. It was the most tremendous fun, and we played them at everything: cricket, hockey, tennis, billiards, and we even did our best in the whiskey stakes. Actually, that description applies to the years between 1920 and 1924, when Sanger was invited to take teams up every summer to Chail, which is a famous cricket ground now because it's known as the sort of highest cricket ground in the world and referred to in many academic works as such. But the actual start of the club was not until July 1925, when, and again, he describes this in his letter of 1956, describes how on a very hot summer evening in July 1925, four young men had dinner at Simpson's in the Strand, and then wandered around the fountains and the statues of Trafalgar Square, discussing the finer details of the club that they were going to set up, not least the name. Um, and to me, Trafalgar Square is an interesting environment for this to have happened in, because, of course, with all the historic imperial statutory, it's rather ironic that the club was going to be formed there, because, in a way, the club, as I've mentioned, embodies the sort of story of empire and then end of empire. Um, but let me describe the four founders who went on this soiree around Trafalgar Square. I've mentioned P.B. Sanger. He was a career soldier, been at Cheltenham College, spent time in the First World War as a Royal Artillery officer, and then went to India with that regiment. But then halfway through his tour in India, he went off to, was posted, I imagine, to the Royal West African Frontier Force. So he was off in Africa for a few years. And when he came back to India, he actually transferred from the British Army to the Indian Army and went into Prince Albert Victor's own cavalry, was the regiment. And he was a very good polo player, allegedly. And it's interesting, I think, as we look at the history of the stragglers, to understand the difference between Indian Army officers and British Army officers. The Indian Army officers were very much part of the country. They had to learn local language. They were tested as such. And if they didn't pass the examinations, they couldn't join their Indian regiments. And so they were very much part of the country, whereas the British officers were a little bit distinct. They remained, of course, surrounded by British soldiers on the whole, whereas as an Indian Army officer, you were surrounded by Indians. So this is, to my mind, this is quite relevant when we look at the history of the stragglers. The second founder was Vernon Maynard, who was a civilian. He had served in the army. He was a Cambridge man, well educated, came from Eastbourne College, which is again relevant. And then he joined the Attock Oil Company in India in exploring for oil, basically where Pakistan is now. And then the third founder was again a soldier from the Northamptonshire Regiment, a Captain Alain Caldwell. Now it's Caldwell who kept a register of players, and he is the one who described one of the first 11 players in the first game, who's named AJ Trollope. He described him as has one arm, bowls a little. And that's where I got the title for the book from, just because I find it an amusing sort of description. And then the fourth founder was, again, an army officer called Frank Mason McFarlane, who later on was to become a military attaché in Berlin and actually recommended assassinating Hitler in 1937. And Mason McFarlane said, you know, I have a clear line of sight from my flat to where Hitler gives his speeches, and I could easily shoot him. Anyway, Mason McFarlane went on to become the governor of Gibraltar during the war, and then, curiously, a Labour MP after it. So those four men were wandered around the fountains of Trafalgar Square, and then the next morning decided on the colours of the stragglers. Vernon Maynard insisted on apple green. And they had decided by then also to make the Maharaja of Patiala an honorary life member. So they chose royal purple as the second color. And then the third color, really in those times, presented itself, which was black. And black was there to signify India. And that may be uncomfortable to modern ears, but that is basically how it was done. For instance, talking about Royal Artillery officers, when my father, who was one, when he transferred from the Indian Army to the British Army, he was known as a black gunner. this being in 1947, 1948. So it was just the language of the times. Anyway, the colours were selected at Foster's the day after the Trafalgar Square meeting, and the club started. The first game was at Eastbourne College in 1925, and by all accounts was very successful. Um, but just to mention a little bit more about, if you like, the fifth founder, the Maharaja of Patiala, was also obviously a critical character in that it had been him that had invited the expatriate soldiers and civilians up to Chael to play, leading up to 1925. And the Maharaja at that time was a very committed cricketer. He actually led at the age of 19. He was appointed captain of the first Indian team to visit England in 1911. And he was fanatical. He wasn't a particularly good cricketer, but he obviously enjoyed it and sponsored a number of the activities. He became slightly controversial character through his life and died in 1937, I think it was. But he is an important figure for the Stragglers, and indeed the Stragglers' connection with the Patiala family has continued to the present day, where the current Maharaja is also honorary life member of our club. And apart from anything else, he was chief minister of Punjab at one stage, so a very powerful man in India. So the club was founded and grew slowly. I mean, 1925, they played at Eastbourne. 1926, they played Eastbourne and Lancing College. But by 1928, they were playing regular games. And they started the Oxford and Cambridge tours, which were a feature until the mid-50s, where basically they traveled to Oxford and Cambridge and played 3 or 4 games in each place. In 1935, they had their first dinner and at the Hotel Metropole in London. And the person who ran the dinner was Sir Francis Stanley Jackson, who had been England's test captain at one stage and was also governor of Bengal between 1927 and 1932. He was actually shot at while he was making a speech at Calcutta University in 1932. And he survived. It was actually a female Indian freedom fighter, Beena Das, who tried to assassinate him. But he, as I mentioned, survived the shooting and carried on making his speech once the smoke had cleared, according to contemporary accounts. He wasn't the last last straggler to be shot at. And one of the most dramatic events in the straggler history comes in 1933 in Midnapore, which is in West Bengal and which is a famously revolutionary part of India, shall we say. And even today, West Bengal, to some extent, marches to a different drum and is not ruled by the party BJP, which rules India overall, and has always been a slightly separate part of the country politically. But Midnapore, which is the scene of the straggler action, is a city which at the time was rather backward in India. And what happened was that there were 3 district officers in quick succession assassinated by freedom fighters in 1931, 1932, and 1933. And it was in 1933 that our straggler club member was the district officer and was killed as he went on to a football pitch. He was already 37 years old, but had taken up playing football again because he knew that it would bring him closer to the populace. His name was Bernard Burge, known as Bobby Burge, and he's a very interesting character, if only for the fact that in 1931, when he proceeded on leave and played with the Stragglers, he actually played 13 out of the 14 available games. The only one he missed was at the one at Eastbourne College, curiously, but he played in all other 13 games. He was an Oxford man, and he was a member, obviously, of the Indian Civil Service, and hence he was the district officer. And as I say, shot as he went on to a football pitch. His assassins were three young Indian freedom fighters, one of whom was only 18, Nirmal Jain, and they were, of course, caught and hung about a year later. But to me, that single instance sort of brings home just how febrile and difficult the environment was that the stragglers were born into. The stragglers then went through the war, and there are a number of losses in the war, which I won't go through at this point, but it's obviously described in the book. But after the war, it's interesting how the club developed. It was set up again in 1946. Obviously, there had been no activities at all during the war. And what we see then is a very interesting progression towards becoming an inclusive club. What had been a club for basically white colonial servants, whether military or civilian, going home on leave every 3 or 4 years and providing a club for them to play for in England. What had been very much a sort of white colonial club started its march to becoming an inclusive, and the inclusive and very broad membership that we have today. But it was not an easy path, and this, from going through the archive, is what has fascinated me. In that, in 1947, obviously India became independent, and sure enough, in 1947, at the committee meeting, we see that this subject is raised as to whether Indians should become members, and basically the question, and I'll quote from the minutes here, the question of Indians becoming eligible for membership was also discussed, and it was decided that the present time was not opportune. So that was the first time it was raised. It was then raised again when a very interesting character called Kit Cowgill became secretary, and it was to be secretary for almost 25 years. And he was ex-Indian Police Service, Kit Cowgill, so he definitely knew how India worked. And shortly after he became secretary, he actually sponsored an extraordinary general meeting in early 1954, April 1954, where the subject of this meeting was, again, do we let Indian members into the club? And again, the feeling was it was not the right time. Now it's difficult, and it would take a long time, and I realize that time is short to go through all the arguments. But it's interesting for me that again the proposal was turned down. One goes fast forward to 1962, and again it's raised, this time by people in India, as to whether Indian members should be admitted to the club, and again it gets turned down. And what's interesting to me is that there was a clear split in the club between the people who, as I described, the Indian Army officers, who were really of the country and had, in many cases, served there for generations, but even if they hadn't, had served through the war, cheek by jowl with Indian soldiers, or had worked for the Indian Forest Service or the Indian Police Service, um, or indeed in the ICS, in the creme de la creme, in Burge's occupation as district officers. Um, it seems to me that this group of people were pro um, opening the club, whereas there was reluctance expressed from people like a fellow called Tom Longfield, who was a very prominent cricketer, but he was the head of one of the managing agents in Calcutta, which, in the course of researching the story, I've come across other historians to talk about these managing agents who were, big conglomerates based in Calcutta, running the jute industry, the tea industry, to an extent, the shipping, a number of industries in India, and had come out of the original sort of East India Company in the 1850s. They are described by other historians as being notoriously racist. Now, I'm not saying that Longfield was racist. There's no evidence. And indeed, he voted when the club finally let its first India member in 1969. Longfield was chairman of the meeting, and the motion passed unanimously. And everything, the club became a fully inclusive club. And as I say, for the purposes of the Cricket Research Network, I think this is the aspect of the club which has been very interesting to me, looking at the contemporary records, the archives, obviously newspapers of the time, and the letters that we've seen, and one or two of which I've referred to. And to me, it's a fascinating history. And now, of course, the club is fully inclusive. We're looking at trying to promote a female section. We've been on many tours to India. We've had, ever since 1969, a fully diversified membership. And indeed, I think many people of South Asian origin are quite attracted to the club by its very moniker, the Stragglers of Asia. So with that, it's been a bit of a quick run through, but I hope it's been of interest, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That's a really interesting overview and detail about the club, and some really interesting elements that you brought up there. I'm just interested, Willy, just while other people may be thinking about questions, please raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll come to you for questions. In terms of the club now, what sort of size is the club, and I guess composition of sort of members in terms of who currently is part of the club?
Well, we are a successful wandering cricket team. We don't have a home base. And I say successful in that we've survived, because many wandering sides have gone into history. And I mentioned one in the book, the Croydon Gentlemen, for instance. Again, it was just amusement to me, but the title. But where have they gone? Or there are many who've disappeared. And the Stragglers, despite not having a sort of home like the Hampshire Hogs or the Sussex Martlets or the Wiltshire Queries, despite not having a geography or a hinterland, and with our natural hinterland of the army and the forces having shrunk so much, which has made recruitment difficult.